No, no. You just want to get cute. Don't. Don't. Face out.
Citizens, I speak to you tonight.
I'll talk to you about the past, about our future, and about very specific concrete plans that will enable this country. Can't hear you. That will enable this country to strengthen itself in a very difficult year ahead. Even the technologies of this age need some human assistance. I'm going to talk to you tonight about this country the way I see it, the truth as I best understand it. I don't want to overstate the case. I don't want to understate it. I want to give to you the best of my thinking, of my insight into where this country is, how it is we got here, and what we must do together to mobilize, to join together, to renew and restore the spirit of this nation. I have no doubt about our ability to achieve that goal. But I know that nothing is possible unless we can understand exactly where we are at this historic moment and how we got here. The political language that we hear is debased. The level of cynicism that many of us feel, many here tonight and across this country, makes it difficult to speak in a human, thoughtful, truthful way about our country. I'll try to do that without the cliches and then give you very specific, concrete plans on where we should go from here. Now, back after World War II, this country was unchallenged, the leading country in the world. We dominated economically, militarily. We had the world as before us, and we were its leader. And the old adversaries, Japan and Germany and much of Japan, were in rubble. And we joined in a Marshall Plan. We rebuilt them. And in rebuilding these other countries, we rebuilt ourselves, and we expanded a level of prosperity that increased at a rate of about 3% a year. And out of this dividend, it's a productivity dividend each year, in the 50s and the 60s, we could afford and did practice in many ways a very generous politics. Wages went up, profits went up, taxes went up, government went involved in new and very diverse programs. But as we started moving into the 60s, those former countries that were in rubble now had rebuilt themselves, had reindustrialized, and now became our competitors on the world stage, and began even here in our own country to supply more and more of the products that formerly we had excelled in. And very gradually, the productivity rate of our country began to decline. In the early 60s, we used to actually export oil to the rest of the world. Our steel industry, our automobile industry, our television industry, our manufacturers of watches, of cameras, we had no peer. And then as we hit the mid-60s, a decision was made by our president at that time, in many ways, I think, because of his own vision of bringing American democracy to other countries, to expand a war in Vietnam, spend hundreds of billions of dollars abroad, and at the same time attempt to create a great society here at home. And as this policy, as it was called at that time, guns and butter, went forward, the historic momentum of this country began to unravel and decline. Instead of paying for that war and that great society out of current dollars, there was employed a fiscal gimmickry, a borrowing from the future by the printing of more and more money, by the running up of huge deficits that only became very obvious in years to come. That borrowing, we now know, has come from us in 1980 and will come from us in the years to come. This country has followed a path that Rome and Germany after World War I and many other countries have pursued, running the printing presses, putting more currency into the system at a far greater rate than it produced goods and services. And as we began this decline in the 60s and the 70s, what had been a growth in our own wealth of 3% a year declined to something below 1%. And so instead of more wages out of real goods produced and more government taxes out of our increase, we began to fight over our decrease, our decline in purchasing power. And more people spent their time figuring out ways of avoiding government regulations, avoiding taxes. More and more people felt, as the inflation rate crept up from 3% to 5% to 7% and on upward, that they had to borrow, that they had to buy often what they didn't even need. The credit card came into vogue. In the 50s, you barely saw it. In the 60s and the 70s, private debt, public debt increased, expanded, accelerated, trying to prop up this slowing economy that was once the giant of this planet. All the while, Japan, Germany, other countries, South Korea, Taiwan, are making cars and watches and other products of great quality. They're entering into this latter part of the 20th century with great momentum. And we, on our part, continue to inflate because our leaders can't tell us the truth, that there is a decline. There's a decline because now the cheap raw materials that went into this great economic machine are now expensive. The third world wants its share, and thus the Arab oil embargo, the quadrupling in the price of oil, and all of these things coming together to make it very difficult the continued economic momentum of our own nation. And so we come to the latter part of the 70s. We find that presidents come and go, the political forces filled with cynicism, one party, one change. It is very hard to sustain that sense of unity, that sense of dynamism, that sense of greatness that we had as a country. We have resorted to the printing press. Our growth rate has declined now. It is negative. There is not an increase in our actual output. We find more and more foreign products inundating our society. We look at our third largest automobile company. We find it's bankrupt. We look at our second largest automobile company. It has lost $1 billion and was only bailed out by its own foreign sales. We look at our number one automobile company, and it has to give people $400 or $500 to get them to buy a car. Truly, it is time to mobilize. It's time to restore and rebuild this country so that we can take care of our own, so that we can again provide ideas and initiatives to the rest of this world. And so we cannot look at cities like the South Bronx or Detroit or other places declining, looking like the remnants of some city after World War II. But rather we can rebuild, and we can stand proud, and we can eliminate the poverty and the deterioration in our own society. It's come time to reindustrialize, and it's not going to hopefully take a war like what happened to Japan and Germany, where you literally have to level the society before you begin to rebuild. Certainly we are wise enough and thoughtful enough and know now the horrors of that particular path that we can rebuild. reindustrialize, invest in the new technologies, in protecting the environment, in educating our people so that we can have a society that once again is on the upward momentum rather than this recessive, restrictive society that is moving toward protective tariffs, toward inefficiency, and in many ways repeating the 1930s, where we want now protective tariffs because our industries can't compete. Other countries then retaliate, world trade slows down, people get poorer, and then war inevitably follows over the competition for the scarce resources. I say that is one path, but the path that I decide to follow, and that I know that if we can all join together and agree to a plan, a call to arms, not for war, but for peace, we can reindustrialize this country. We can regain a self-reliance and an independence that will serve our human needs. Now, there are three parts to that. First of all, you got to stabilize the economy. You have to stop the inflation. And you do that first very quickly. We are producing every year, 8% the money supply goes up, even though the amount of goods only goes up 2%. We've got to stop the printing press. Government can't print any more money than the society is making goods. You got to balance the budget. You have to be able to index the income tax so that when the government inflates your pay raise and it really isn't any more purchasing power, you lower your tax bracket. You don't give government more money because of its own mistake in creating the inflation. And then you exempt personal savings up to $20,000 from any income tax to encourage thrift, to encourage saving. That's what builds for the future. And then you've got to give some incentive for people to once again buy in America, buy into the companies of this nation, and I would allow a tax exemption for the first $5,000 of dividend income that could be received. But that is just the first step in a beginning stabilization of the economy and inflation. But still, we have to rebuild. We have to reindustrialize. We have to be able to retool, re-equip, so American workers can have the tools so that they can produce just as good as anyone else. 20 years ago we did, but now we're not, but we can. And I know we can if we're prepared to make that commitment. It's an agreement. It's a joining together of the people of this nation. That's all it takes. It's our own mind changing and following through on what must be done. Now, how do we do that? We develop a strategic plan to industrialize these countries, whether it's the trains or the cars or whatever it is, the new era technology. We have to commit to it. And we do it first by having a plan with labor, organized labor, business, and government pulling together. I've seen what they've done in Japan. They cooperate together, they lay out a plan, they say we will produce a car that will dominate the world markets, and they go do it. And they work together. The unions, the employers, the government, they're not in this adversary pulling and hauling and fighting and tugging. We're at the point now where we can't afford that. We don't have that luxury of this adversary process. It's time for a joint effort. And toward that objective, as we lay out an economic plan to rebuild our country, I would give tax incentives and lower interest credit to those who participate in rebuilding what this society needs and getting off this mounting debt and waste and packaging and excessive advertising of those things that we do not need. Then I would issue reindustrialization bonds so that people can invest in these new projects that would supply the wherewithal for our society so that we can ensure a prosperity and a standard of living for all the people in our country. Next, I would double the research efforts. We need a very specific commitment to our universities, to our private sector research, to the creative genius Where is the Thomas Edison and the Marconi of 1980 that will invent the new era technologies in health science, in preserving the quality of our environment, in alternative energy, in mass transit, in information technologies that can revolutionize the world and make this planet a very small global village where we begin to sense that we are part of an interconnected family on a very small speck in this universe. An increase in our research. Next, I would call a North American summit with Canada and Mexico to lay the framework for a North American economic community. We are the richest, most secure region on the planet, but we must begin, and we must begin to work together as a common market. Next, I would call an international forum whereby the developed countries of Europe and Japan and America, the richer countries, can draw up a partnership arrangement with the poorer, lesser developed countries, and we can exchange our health science capacities, our technology, our energy, our know-how for their raw materials, and together, in a cooperative effort, creating a new economic order in this world, we can lift all of us. Instead of a separation, we would cooperate to the advantage of all of us, instead of this retreat into selfish, protective barriers that will make us all the poorer on this planet. And finally, I would reestablish the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps that Roosevelt started in the 30s, because I believe that is what is needed, not a draft. What is required is to re-interest the young men and women of this country in our future. And we do that by offering them an opportunity of voluntary service to restoring our environment, planting the millions of trees in the acreage that lies empty at this point, working in the cities, a domestic Peace Corps for the young to assist the elderly, to work in the rural areas, an opportunity of service, of camaraderie, of esprit de corps, of discipline. And were this country ever to be threatened, I would feel far more confident of a youth of the nation that has learned service in a program to build, and not some draft bureaucracy that will only alienate. Finally, I want to talk about energy. Now, energy is not an easy problem. It's been with us. We've all talked about it. I want to give you some specific points on how to deal with it. First of all, I'm not going to suggest a 50-cent or $1 or any other kind of tax on the gasoline. I think we have to have sacrifice equal, and therefore a rationing program that will affect the rich, the poor, and everyone in the middle. 5% of this world's population, which is what we are, cannot continue to consume 30% of the oil resources of the world. So we've got to cut back, and we cut back immediately with a fair, equitable coupon rationing method. Secondly, I would ban the importing of foreign oil by any private company. These oil companies are getting oil from governments, and therefore we should establish a U.S. buying authority to channel oil imports, government to government, so that we can get the best possible price and we can deal in a straightforward, above the table manner with these foreign countries, rather than manipulating the spot price as some of our multinational oil companies tend to do. Next, we're going to need foreign oil for a while. There's no doubt of it. We want to try to overcome it, minimize it, but in order to assure a stable supply and a stable price, I would enter into long-term contracts with Mexico or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela, and I would make this bargain: hold down the price of oil, guarantee us a secure supply, we'll use less, but we will pay you in dollars that we guarantee will be as good as gold. If our inflation goes up, we'll hold you harmless. You know that when you sell us your oil, you're not exchanging it for dollars that lose their value at the rate of 20% a year. That's no bargain, and because of that, they have to keep raising their prices even higher than they would have. And we have to recognize that we, as well as they, are part of the problem. And if we cooperate by controlling our own inflation, we can also control the price of that oil. Finally, I want to make a commitment, a 7-year commitment to end this energy waste. We waste between 40 and 50% of the energy we consume. There are people that are telling us to build more and more power plants while we are yet wasting, in the mind of the Harvard Business School, 40%, in the eyes of others, 50% of the energy we produce. That's profligate, it's scandalous, it's unnecessary. And over the next 7 years, if we mobilized, if we had a program of retrofit, weatherization, retooling our factories, our businesses, and our homes, we could cut that waste in half. And that would be jobs, it would protect our environment, it would be energy sufficiency. And we could pay for it by having the utilities finance that work, which would be conservation, rather than some of these centralized power plants that are dangerous to the environment, carry very few jobs, and take 12 years to construct. Conservation is ready the moment you put it in. Next, I would want a full-scale commitment to cogeneration, the recapture of waste steam, to small-scale hydroelectric plants, to solar, to photovoltaics, to all the alternative energies. Not many people are aware of the fact that we waste more steam in this country leaking out of factories than is generated in all the nuclear power plants presently operating. And if we were to turn the pricing structure around so that utilities would buy back the surplus power that farmers can generate by small-scale hydroelectric plants, that communities can generate, that factories can make by putting technology, boilers and generators and turbines on their own processes, we can generate at least 50,000 megawatts of electrical power without in any way hurting the environment, increasing the number of jobs by tens of thousands, and diversifying our energy sources. Decentralization, not putting it more and more in the hands of the few, but spreading it out so that we all participate in our own energy future. Next, mass transit. When I look to another country and I see they have a train, they call it a bullet train that goes 120 miles an hour. I know we can do the same thing if we had the commitment. We could have a train that could go from Milwaukee to Chicago at 120 miles an hour, maybe faster, and could go from one city to another. We have the power. We have the power if we want to, if we make the commitment, and if we take the funds by cutting out the MX missile. We'll have $100 billion to finance that mass transit for people. And we can do the same thing with fuel-efficient cars. We can make a car that'll get 60 miles to the gallon if we want. If the government and the 3 automobile companies and our scientists and we pull together, we can do it. And in that fashion, we will reduce our dependency on foreign oil and create our self-reliance and make America a stronger country.
Okay, can you move forward? Hi, Governor Brown. Good to see you again. I'd like you to comment on what you do about the ERA and why you'd be a better president than the other candidates.
Very simply, I would take all the recalcitrant legislators who have been voting against that ERA and bring them to Washington and keep them there until I could change their mind. And I think I could do that. But why would I make a better president? The best answer that I could give you is to tell you just something about myself personally. You've heard about ideas, you heard about specific programs. I want to tell you just a little bit about me, what I've done, and then you judge. When I was a kid, I didn't get too interested in politics, but my father, as some of you may know, was the district attorney. He became the attorney general in California. And every day at the dinner table, we'd hear politics. I learned about it. And I often didn't see my father. He didn't come home too many times in a week. He went out almost every night in doing his work as politics, district attorney, attorney general, doing his work. And I, quite frankly, didn't like politics. I didn't like all the handshaking. I didn't like all the smiling, all to have to stand there and have my picture taken and look like I enjoyed it. Well, I didn't enjoy it. And so I decided that I would seek a different way of life. I wanted to become a priest. And I went to the Jesuit seminary for 3.5 years, and I was trying to find out a very different way of life. I really thought things were too materialistic. I wasn't interested in the outside. I wanted to find out what was inside me. I wanted to find out the meaning and the quest that I was on. I wanted to find God. I really didn't want politics. And so I went there, and for 3.5 years, I trained in a program that if I had stayed, it would have lasted 13 years. But I learned a great deal. We had to wait on tables, had to clean toilets, sweep floors, work out in grape fields, maintain silence. No magazines, no television, none of that. Isolation. And as I learned that, I developed a commitment to try to be of service. And I found out that it isn't just within, it's without. And I left that seminary and I went out to the university and I went to law school and I came back and I joined the opposition to the war in Vietnam. I ran for Secretary of State and Governor. I began to come back and I took those skills that I learned from my father and I applied them in California. And I've worked there for over 5 years in a state that if it were a country would be the 8th largest state in the world. And because of that, I believe I have the skills. I believe I've got the know-how and I've got the will to mobilize this country and to bring it back to that level of pride and self-reliance and independence that I know that we can all possess. And so let me just conclude with this one thought. Much of what we have, all of what we have, certainly we have inherited from our parents. But let us look at it and view it as something we borrow from our children. And as we look to the future, let us pledge our allegiance to that future. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you and good night.
Make sure it works. One.